and want to introduce our moderator for the day. Our authors are going to be signing books after the session. If you have your books, we hope that you will help us by exiting the same direction that you came in. The book signing tent is to the left. Have your books there. We're going to sneak the authors out as quickly as possible to get there so that you won't wait long. There will be no Q&A for this session. It will be an hour session that Robin will facilitate, and then we will go forward into the day. The books are available to purchase. We are grateful for Karis Bookstore for providing all of the book services for this. The Decatur Book Festival is a nonprofit. It is dependent on sponsors and donations to bring great authors to Decatur each year. If you will, consider a tax-deductible donation to support the festival. Go to the festival website. As you are generous, please be kind to us. Now, please check all of your gadgets and gizmos and make sure they are on silent so that we can all hear well what we've got here. Now, let me introduce Dr. Robin Morris, who will then introduce our speakers and facilitate the panel. Dr. Morris is an associate professor of history at Agnes Scott College in Decatur, Georgia. She has recently published the book Goldwater Girls to Reagan Women with the University of Georgia Press. She will tell you more about the authors and their books. She will be available to sign your books as well. So, with all of that, it is a great pleasure to welcome you and to welcome Robin, Ernie, Mike, and Greg.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jack, and everyone who's come out today on what we thought was going to be a rainy day, but we're very excited that we have gorgeous weather here. And I want to give a special thanks to Denise Auger for bringing the panel together and for scheduling us at a time that does not conflict with any football games. Go Dogs! So let's hunker down and talk about some politics. I'm going to introduce from the far end, there's Greg Bluestein, who's a political reporter that we have all been relying on. We've all been relying on him to make sense of state politics for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He also contributes to Political Insider blog, the Jolt newsletter, and is often on the radio, also explaining politics to those of us who are a little too sleepy to see the newspaper in the morning but listen on the radio. He's a graduate of the University of Georgia with degrees in journalism, again, go Dogs, and political science, and he lives with his wife and 2 daughters in Metro Atlanta. And his book is flipped. I've got them all up here so you can see what you're buying. It's a great cover. How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Powers. And as an Agnes Scott professor, I love it when things turn purple. All right, Mike Luckovich in the middle has been drawing editorial cartoons and keeping us happy in Atlanta for 33 years, and thankfully still loves doing it. We hope you'll keep doing it for a long time. For 30 years, he was drawing his cartoons at the AJC, but since the pandemic, like a lot of us, moved into his basement. And he has won numerous awards, only because you haven't been competing with me for Messiest Desk. He's won most misspellings in a drawing, maximum application of whiteout in a single image, again, because most of us stopped using whiteout in the last century. And congratulations to him, September 11th marked the 40th year his wife has put up with him. So his book is The Twisted History.
Thank you.
Of the GOP. And right next to me, let me get the right one, is Ernie Suggs, who is also a reporter. We have the AJC trifecta up here. He's currently covering race and culture. At the AJC, he's also the publisher of the paper's weekly Black-oriented newspaper, Unapologetically ATL. He was a writer for the Herald Sun, and in 1996, he was awarded a fellowship by the Education Writers Association, which culminated in his award-winning Pulitzer-nominated series, Fighting to Survive: Historically Black Colleges and Universities Face the 21st Century. We have a lot of Pulitzer power up here on the stage. Y'all feel free to rub that off on the other two of us. In 2005, he became the vice president of the National Association of Black Journalists, and he was chosen for the prestigious Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University in 2008, and in 2009, he joined the board. He received the Pioneer Black Journalist Award from the NABJ in 2013, and his book is The Many Lives of Andrew Young. My copy doesn't have a cover, but it's an awesome book, and you should absolutely go look at it. And his reporting on the Atlanta race massacre recently is something you really need to look at. If any of my students are here, you're going to read it next semester, so go ahead and get a jump on it. It's really wonderful, including a thoughtful piece about the language we use to talk about it. So highly encourage you to read that. All right, so let's begin. And I want to start today by acknowledging that this is President Jimmy Carter's 98th birthday. The AJC has a list online right now of 98 ways to honor him, and because we want him to live several more years, I want to do 99, 100, 101. And President Carter actually shows up in each of your books. He's sort of a common thread. I think you can't talk Georgia politics without, I mean, he's in mine. I go back to the 60s. He's there. So I wanted to begin today by asking each of you to give a reflection on Jimmy Carter's role and legacy in Georgia politics. So let's just work down the line. We'll start with Greg and come back to Ernie.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming. This is a great crowd, and we're so excited to speak to you about Georgia politics and everything else. Jimmy Carter, I covered him actually first for the Associated Press here in Atlanta, and I got to go to Haiti and the Dominican Republic with him for a big series of stories I wrote about 15 years ago now. And that's where I got to see a few things from the former president. First, his dedication to fighting global disease. He was there in part to fight something called schistosomiasis, which was a deadly parasitic worm. And I saw firsthand how he was helping the people of Haiti who had never heard of him, right? I mean, some of the villages he was visiting had never really seen any outside visitors, let alone a former president. But how he spoke individually with each of the people there and made it his dedication, determination to fight these global scourges. But the other thing I learned from that trip with him, and I get a little schmaltzy here, but his devotion and love affair with his wife. I was like in near tears just watching them talk to each other about how they met, about their commitment to one another. And at the time, I was a newlywed, and I just remember telling my wife, going on and said, if we're 1/10 of the relationship they have, we'll be set for life. And so that was my biggest takeaway from my time with the former president. Of course, later on, after that trip, I ended up covering Jason, his grandson, running for governor, and now Jason is following in his footsteps as one of the leaders of the Carter Center here in Atlanta. But it was a real treat to be able to cover Jimmy Carter through the political lens, but honestly see his personal devotion to his passionate causes and to his wife.
So I love the Carters. I mean, they are such a wonderful couple and their whole family. And you know, as a cartoonist, you know, I've always followed him and drawn cartoons when appropriate about him. When I learned that he had brain cancer a few years ago, and I mentioned this in my book, I was doing some crappy cartoon. I was almost done with it, and I found out late in the day that Carter had brain cancer. So I thought, you know, I wanted to do a cartoon on that. And so I thought about it, and I came up with something. And so I talked to my editor, Andre, and I said, listen, Andre, you know, I know it's late in the day. You know, they like me to have my cartoon done by around 6 o'clock, and and so I was just finishing up the cartoon I was working on. And I said, but Andre, I really think I should do something on the Carters because, they're so wonderful. And so he said, okay, just draw really fast. And so I did. And so the cartoon I drew, if you follow my cartoons, I draw a lot of times in my cartoons kind of a husband and wife. And the wife is always, she's larger, the husband's smaller. The wife always makes the intelligent comments. The little guy always makes the, stupid kind of Trump positive comments. So that's sort of the two of them. So what I did is I drew them out in front of their yard, out in their front yard. You see their house in the background, and they're pounding in a campaign sign, and the campaign sign says, Carter for Cancer Survivor. So that ran the next day, and a day or two later, I get a call from someone in Plains, and they said, hey, we saw your drawing. Can we do that? Can we make those campaign signs? And I said, oh yeah, that would be great. And this is what is so amazing about being a cartoonist, is sometimes you're doing a cartoon and you hear nothing, but then other times something will come of it, or else you get a whole bunch of hatred. It's really very interesting. So anyways, what happened is after Carter was dismissed from Emory, and he and Rosalind were heading back to Plains, when he got to Plains, they were in there, like a vehicle with protection and stuff. And so they're going down the main street, and on either side of Main Street are those, like 500 of those campaign signs based on my cartoon. So he got out of his car, President Carter did. He took a picture of that, and he sent me a nice note and the picture and everything. And so it was just like such an amazing thing. And I've had other interactions with him and Rosalind. They were just such humble people, and so it's been a privilege to draw cartoons like that for him.
Well, for me, I think one of my first political memories as a child was Watergate. And I remember just being so confused and not understanding what the country was dealing with. This is me as a child, like 4 or 5 years old. Then, 1976, my mother takes me to PS 241 in Brooklyn, New York, and she votes for Jimmy Carter. And I saw in this person, I'm a child, I'm a kid. I saw in this person something different than obviously Richard Nixon. So Jimmy Carter for me was kind of the first president that I knew as a child. And moving to Georgia, moving to Atlanta, being able to cover him, has been such a kind of a revelation. And just, when you think about who you are as a journalist, and Greg and Mike can probably say this, like, we get to meet a lot of people. We meet everybody. I met Prince, I met President Obama, I met everybody. Michael Jackson, that's a story for another day. But meeting Jimmy Carter and covering Jimmy Carter has been just this amazing adventure for me. And what I'm struck by, and if you look at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution today, is I wrote a story about people who run into Jimmy Carter, people who bumped into him and saw him at the airport or saw him at Maranatha Church in Plains, and he's just so kind and taking photographs of people, taking photographs with anybody who wants to take a photograph, or shaking hands with somebody on an airplane. So, you mentioned about how he's in all of our books. He wrote the foreword for my book. And when you talk about kindness and when you talk about generosity and, understanding what he's been dealing with over the last few years, and when I called and said, hey, I'm writing this book about Andrew Young, would you consider it? And it was like, no problem, I got it within a week. So, the thing that I enjoy about President Carter and, his legacy politically as well as humanitarian, is that a word? As well as humanitarian, is his kindness and just what he means so much to this country, what he means to Georgia. And I think that's the important thing, what he means to Georgia and what he represents in Georgia, because, Georgia gets a lot of bad raps about a lot of things. And Greg's wonderful book talks about how we've changed how we're changing as a state. But Jimmy Carter has been consistent in presenting Georgia as a place of tolerance, as a place where people can get along if we try. So I think that's going to be his biggest legacy.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And how many people in the crowd have any interaction with Jimmy Carter, like Ernie was talking about?
Send me your stories.
Amazing.
Yeah,
It's amazing.
It's just an amazing legacy and an amazing story. And one of the things that Jimmy Carter, I think, did for the world, of the many things, was appointing Andrew Young as UN ambassador. Could you talk about that experience of, what Andrew Young was in your process of collaborating on this book? What was he saying about his period working with him?
Well, the name of my book is The Many Lives of Andrew Young, and one of those lives that I talk about is his relationship with President Carter, leaving Congress to join the United Nations as the U.S. ambassador. And one of the interesting things about Andrew Young in that period is that when you think about John Lewis was the congressman in that seat forever. And Andy Young could have been John Lewis, if that makes any sense, because he could have stayed in that seat forever, but he decided, in one of his wild thinkings that, it would be better for him to kind of go over to the United Nations and work with Jimmy Carter. And as I mentioned in the book, how do you say no to Jimmy Carter? It was, as you all know, those of you who follow President Carter and follow Andrew Young, it was an interesting period, just 3 or 4 years in which he was an ambassador, because Andy Young is a person, and Mike knows this by covering him, he says what he wants to say, and he does what he wants to do. And sometimes when you're in a diplomatic role, sometimes you shouldn't probably say and do what you want to do. So it got him into a lot of trouble. But, he's still, so he was basically fired right before President Carter lost the 1980 election. So he kind of served his term out, but he was technically, let go from that position. But he still has a lot of reverence for President Carter. When I went down for President Carter's 75th wedding anniversary, which is in and of itself is an amazing thing, Andrew Young was right there, front and center. So they still have a really good relationship, a really good friendship.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to point out that Mike also has a beautiful cartoon about the 75th anniversary of the Carters. That one's really, really powerful. And like Greg said, relationship goals. Absolutely. So Mike, I'm going to step into a different part of politics. Your book took me way back. So first of all, it made me feel old because you had the Bush administration in black and white, and I remember those years in color. But you go back to the W. Bush administration, the John Roberts confirmation. It was sort of jarring to go so far back. And then it goes up through just a few months ago with the invasion of Ukraine. So after you published A Very Stable Genius, what made you want to take the story back further into the history of the GOP? And when do you think the first turns of the twisted history began?
Well, there is no major plan. First of all, it's mainly, I get a call a few years ago from my publisher, and he says, "Hey, do you want to do a book about Trump?" And I said, "Okay." And so that was where Stable Genius came from. And then around a year ago, the publisher calls me again and says, "Hey, do you want to do something on the Republicans and kind of the history of the Republicans?" So it's actually the publisher that's, I'm just saying, okay, that sounds great. I mean, I just,
I want to sell some
I don't have to, unlike, I was going to say Bert and Ernie, unlike Greg and Ernie.
I'll take Bert.
Sorry. I don't have to write. I write very little. I write very little. I just collate my cartoons. So it's probably less intensive than what these guys are doing. And I'm going on here, and I don't even remember the question you asked me. But first,
just say what you want to say.
But first, before we go on, I want to recognize, you all that read the AJC. Well, Bill Torpy, he's in the room right now with you, watching. Stand up there, Bill. Bill, stand. Come on, man.
In an Atlanta Olympic shirt made possible by Andrew Young.
And one other thing. Okay, where's Kitty? Okay. Okay, I owe Kitty a t-shirt. Hold on. Okay, there you go. I didn't want to forget that. Okay. Okay.
Okay.
So is there a question?
I think we're good. I think it's more, do you want to say anything else?
Oh. Well, you
gonna be
get
the
me
mic
started
show.
and I just won't shut up, so. No.
Maybe I should-
Let me say first, and then I'll stop. But it is a fabulous pleasure for us to be here with you today. We're so appreciative that you read our paper, that we feel like we are reaching you. I have been at other book festivals, and it's so nice that people will come up to me when I'm signing my book, and they'll say, it means a lot that we can read you, and it kind of reassures us that, I'm not crazy, that other people feel like I do. And so I always find that that's comforting, because it's, what we've been going through in this country has been, as with you, it's been difficult for me. And so, and I feel like, my cartoons might not change anything, but if I can provide some comfort and get my point out there, I feel like I'm doing the best that I can. And that's why, I've been at the AJC for over 30 years, but I still feel such a desire to just get the best message out that I can every day. And when I do a crappy cartoon, it just makes me feel so rotten. But I know that the next day I can redeem myself. I can come back in and, I guess I'm not coming back in. I'm going back down into my basement. I used to go into the paper, but I can do another cartoon, and I love being able to do this, and I really do appreciate that you all want to look at them. So thank you.
Okay, since you talked about going in the basement, a lot of us went into the basement. And one thing that came through in your books was just how much we've been through in the last couple of years. It was a little PTSD as I was reading some of them, things that I had blocked for a little while. We've just a summary: primary elections, runoffs, general elections, runoffs, denials, insurrections, impeachments, demonstrations, pandemics, vaccinations, and that's just the beginning. So congratulations to all of us, I just want to say, for getting back here and being together. But at what point, give yourselves a hand. Good job. So at what point in waves hands furiously, all this, did you find the inspiration to write the book? And I'll start with you, Greg, especially with, it's still happening.
It's still happening, and we still could be going through some of those phases again. I don't want to say the R word too loud, but we might be in another runoff situation in a few months. So it's interesting because Mike's experience is very different from mine, where Mike just has publishers saying, hey, we're going to publish your book tomorrow. Where in my case, and probably in Ernie's case too, there's a kind of a more conventional book pitching process. And mine came, frankly, in the middle, right after the November election of 2020, and I'm in the middle of the runoffs, right, or maybe the very beginning of the runoff. And an agent, a very aggressive young agent, called me and he said, I think you've got a book here. And I said, cool, what do I do now? And he said, you've got to go write a book proposal, which is an entirely different science than anything I've ever done before. And I kind of committed myself, after I got buy-in from my editors and buy-in from, more importantly, from my wife, I committed myself to that process at nights and weekends doing the runoff. And my goal was to have the book proposal into the publishers before January 5th, which was the runoff. I wanted them to see the book proposal while it was still fresh in their minds, because I had no idea what would happen in the runoff. But I wanted them to see it before and be excited by it and energized by it. So I spent a lot of time late at nights until 2, 3 in the morning sometimes, some nights, working on what ended up being a 90-page book proposal. Got it to my editors, got it to my agent, I should say, who got it to the different publishers. And then, of course, January 5th happened, January 6th happened, and a week later I had the interviews with all the different publishers who were interested in the book. But it was a very different process. I write about this in my book, but I'm a shoe leather reporter. I've worked through these souls right here. I'm used to writing literally 2, 3 stories a day some days, maybe sometimes even more, through the different various outlets we've got. I've got newsletters and podcasts and all those different things with my colleagues, and of course the digital edition and the print edition of the AJC. And so working on a story for more than a week, 2 weeks is a lot for me, right? Because there's so much happening all the time. I've got a list of stories on my phone that I should be doing, that I'm always feeling guilty about. I should be writing this story. I should be writing that story right now. So working on a book was a very unique experience for me. It was great. It was the most challenging experience I've ever had professionally, but it was also, of course, the most rewarding because I got to take a step back. I got to spend weeks just doing interviews for the book. I got to help organize and fashion a timeline for what we went through. And yeah, it was some PTSD because I was reliving it as well. And there were some real tough times, right? Pandemic, the protests for racial justice, a lot of things that we collectively went through as a city and as a state. I tried to capture in the book through the political lens how it changed Georgia's political dynamic.
And Ernie, you were doing a collaboration while we're going through a pandemic, through these important demonstrations for racial justice. Can you talk about how that developed during the past couple of years?
Yeah, so for me, just like Greg, I think the pandemic coming along at a time when I was trying to write this book was actually a good timing for it because Greg could probably tell you that we work all the time. We work at home now, basically, so we're always working and we're always not working. So we're always kind of in a constant sense of writing and reporting at midnight or 3 o'clock in the afternoon or whatever. So the book idea came along in a sense that I've been wanting to write a book about a civil rights figure for a long time. In March of 2020, we lost Joe Lowry. In July of 2020, we lost C.T. Vivian. These are 2 people that I had often approached about writing books. Joe Lowry wrote a small book before he passed away, and C.T. Vivian was writing a book, and he passed away at the time of his, before the book was actually finished. And if you look at his last book, a lot of what is in his book is my reporting. So my reporting kind of finished his book. So at that point, Andy Young and I got together and was thinking, he wanted to do something, I wanted to do something. Andy Young understands also marketing as well and branding as well. He was approaching his 90th birthday, so we decided that we were going to do this coffee table book. So basically during the pandemic, during 2021, most of 2021, I sat down for a series of interviews with them, did all the research, wrote the book, basically. And, if you look at the book, that's probably a book that probably should have taken 2 years to do. That we kind of wanted to get it done before his birthday and published before March 12th. So it was a kind of, like I said, it was kind of it wasn't grueling because, like I said, we're working from home, so that kind of gives me a little bit of freedom to kind of be at home and write. And as I said, we're always writing, we're always doing work. So I would write a story, something about the pandemic or something about, whatever, and then just go and write a chapter of the book or, vice versa. So it was just an ongoing process, and it was tiring, but it was obviously very rewarding at the end because, even Andy Young has said that, he wrote his book, An Easy Burden, in 1995. That was his autobiography. And he said on the tour, we're kind of on a book tour right now, that this book is better than his, but I don't know if that's the case or not, but it's better than his book because this gives another generation and his grandchildren a chance to kind of read his life through photographs. And one of the great things about Andy Young is that his whole life is kind of chronicled in photographs and news images from the time he was pretty much born up until now. So this book kind of illustrates his life in a way that his own autobiography was not able to do.
Yeah, the photos are really powerful, and he does include photos of his grandchildren, and he has great-granddaughter,
Yeah.
is that right, in the book. Did they participate? Did they give you any good stories?
Yeah, I mean, I talked to his daughters and his son, Bo. So I talked to his whole family, his wife, his brother, so he has a large family, and, everybody was very cooperative in the whole process.
That's great. And I know, Greg, your daughters were also out there on the campaign trail helping you. There's a great scene where one of his daughters interviews Kelly Loeffler. So do you want to talk some about the young reporters on the beat?
So I was writing this book during the pandemic, and my kids go to DeKalb County Public Schools, and at the time, the school system was virtual only. So they were home a lot. I was home a lot. My wife was not home a lot because she was working at Emory University Hospital down the street, so she was as busy as ever. I was as busy as ever too, but both the kids were also with me hanging out. And so I would drag them on the campaign trail. And at the time, my oldest daughter decided she'd make the most of it, and she created something called Bluestein blogs on YouTube. And you probably can't see it because my wife insisted it would be private, but they interviewed all 4 Senate runoff candidates. And the first one was John Ossoff at an event here in DeKalb, I think it was in South DeKalb, at a Get Out the Vote event. And at the time, Senator Ossoff had not yet had his newborn. And so he wasn't necessarily as used to being around kids, maybe. And so my daughter asks him, Senator, what's with all these negative campaign ads? And he looks her in the eye and he just rattles off this long-winded answer on McCain Feingold campaign finance reform. And my daughter's like, what is he saying? And one of his aides is in the background going, John, oy. The next stop was with Raphael Warnock in Gwinnett County, and my daughter asked him, what makes you prepared to be a senator? You came from a background of being a pastor and not a lawyer or a doctor or another profession. And he looked at her and he said, that's so much better than any question your dad has ever asked. This is probably true. And then it was around New Year's, it was right before New Year's, out in Carrollton, Georgia, and my daughter was in the back of a bar with Kelly Loeffler, and we're interviewing her right before the runoff, and she asked Kelly the same question that she asked John Ossoff, which was, what's with all the negative ads? And literally as she's asking the question, a negative ad pops up, radical liberal Raphael Warnock, and she gives that answer. She says, radical liberal Raphael Warnock. I mean, even to at the time a 9-year-old, Kelly Loeffler was still very, very on message on the radical liberal rim. But my favorite interaction was with David Perdue. We were in Monroe, Georgia, and the schools were still shut down. Schools were still virtual only, and my daughter wanted to go back, like so many other students. And she asked Senator Perdue what he would do to make sure students should get back to school, and does he think students should go back to in-person learning? And he kind of pauses, he gets down on one knee and he goes, what do you think, little girl? And my daughter goes, what a dodge. And I said, yep, that's what politicians do. Welcome to my world. But it really was fun bringing them along with me and getting them. I don't think they want to go into this line of work, although my oldest does want to become president, which I'm all for, yes. But it was a treat being able to bring them with me and get them to experience some of the campaign trail fun, because it is fun. We go to all sorts of neat places, and you get to go behind the scenes and see a lot of things and see a lot of parts of Georgia you might not otherwise see.
Yeah, I was having to get out my map to know where some of these places were. I had to do that when I was writing my own, too. I just had a map of Georgia County, so I knew where I was talking about. There's a lot of them, too. 150. So, Mike, your job is to be funny, and you're very good at it. But then you wrote about the stress of your job in the Trump years, and you wrote, while I occasionally use humor in my cartoons, they've become more urgent, more about waking up my fellow citizens to what's happening. And a lot of the cartoons in this book aren't funny. They're really poignant, particularly the chapter about gun violence. And I was wondering, would you talk about this shift that you went through being a cartoonist in an era where it was hard to find the humor?
Yeah. So for the first 10, maybe 15 years drawing here in Atlanta, things were kind of normal. I mean, Republicans would win, Democrats would win. There'd be, disagreements, But it all, and I may refer to this in the book as this way. It was like, I sort of liken it to being a plane that's on autopilot. You know, it's going to land, it's going to be okay, and then with the arrival of George W. Bush, I started seeing the norms that we were used to in politics sort of going away, and then of course that just, and then the bright spot was of course for me was Obama, and that calmed me, but then when Trump arrived, and the disappearing norms just, you know, the guardrails of democracy started being overrun, I guess. I don't know what the right word is, but that's when I started thinking, oh man, I can't, you know, I'm not comfortable anymore just kind of drawing cartoons that make people laugh, but you know, they need to have a point. And they don't necessarily even need to be funny anymore because of the seriousness of the situation that we're in. And so I think that the seriousness of the moment that has made me work harder to get my points across in a way that hopefully will wake people up, and so that's what I'm trying to do. It would be nice, though, eventually to get back to that point where I felt like we were on autopilot again, and things were going to be okay. And I don't have that feeling at this point. I mean, I think we're on knife's edge when it comes to democracy and autocracy. And as a matter of fact, there's a gallery owner in Key West, and she's had some of my cartoons at her gallery, and she knows she represents a cartoonist who has passed away, Jeff McNelly, who is one of my heroes and one of the reasons that I got into cartooning. So she's very familiar with cartoons, and she represents many Cuban artists. And so I and another Cox cartoonist, Mike Peters, who draws for the Dayton Daily News, and also Dave Barry, who is a humor columnist, now a book author, and so the three of us, we did a thing in Key West a few months ago, just a talk, and we got to talking about, you know, where the country was going. And I was pretty bleak when it came to that, and Dave Barry, on the other hand, was saying, no, it's going to be fine. You know, we've had tough times before. And so Nance, the gallery owner, she called me yesterday and she said, you know, when Dave Barry mentioned that a few months ago, it relieved me. You know, I felt good, but she said, now that I've been watching this Ken Burns Holocaust documentary, she said, you know, you're right. It's, you know, you're right. And I just thought that was kind of maybe not funny, but I still feel like we're in a kind of a dark situation. But I'm an eternal optimist, and I think that sometimes even when things are bleak, that helps propel us forward. And I think we're I think the reason why we're in this situation is because we are suffering from an old white manism. Fox TV, you know, the country for the better is, as it always has, is changing, and that scares a lot of old white guys. And so they are trying, you know, through non-democratic means to hold power. But I think that Americans have been awakened to that in many ways, and you know, the recent overturning of Roe, I think people realize, hey, we ain't on autopilot anymore. We got to help fly the plane. And so I'm hopeful, but we're not out of the woods yet, and I don't even remember what the question was that you had asked me.
That's okay. You're really good at being like a student and like, I'm just going to talk until
Okay.
I say something.
Yeah.
So,
Well, thank you for that.
very good. There's no rubric on this one, so you're doing great.
Okay.
All right. Since you brought up the old white manism, I do want to talk about race because I don't think we can talk about Georgia politics without addressing the role of race, including white nationalism, including the growing diversity in Georgia and the long history of the civil rights movement here. And this state has a history of all of this, right? We have a history of great immigrant communities, we have a history of civil rights movement, and we have a history of segregationist politics here. So we have some of the boldest leaders like Andrew Young, and then we have Greg, your book talks about some of the recent cases, including the Rayshard Brooks killing. But then you also find some hope in the election of Georgia's first Jewish senator and first African American senator in the modern era. So what would you hope your readers are taking away? Where are you hoping that Georgia will be going in terms of our race relations? Maybe I should ask, where do you think we're going and where do you want us to go?
Yeah,
Those might be different things.
I definitely want to hear Ernie on this one too. But I think in Georgia, you saw the black electorate and the African Americans show their electoral muscle in the last few elections, right? Stacey Abrams did what many people wouldn't think possible when she got in the race, which was she didn't win, but she got within 55,000 votes in 2018. She flipped the suburbs of Atlanta, which was a defining political moment that Hillary Clinton had done a few years earlier, but this was in a midterm when you have lower turnout. And so that was a huge moment. And what people tend to, people in this room know, but people outside of Georgia tend to not know as much, is that the suburbs of Atlanta are no longer this monolithic stand-in for white voters, right? The suburbs have become increasingly diverse, particularly Gwinnett County, Cobb County as well. She was able, and Democrats, in a broader sense, were able to harness that electoral muscle and encourage a lot of voters who skip midterm elections and who would sit out presidential elections. And they did it with an authentic message, right? The change we've seen in Georgia is Democrats 10 years ago wouldn't talk about gun control. It was seen as a politically astute move not to go embrace some of these, not to go out and talk about abortion rights, not to talk about your role as pushing gun restrictions, right? Democrats run as NRA Democrats because they wanted to kind of take that issue off the table for Republicans. It was seen as a campaign killer if you talked about issues that are now, according to AJC polls, in the mainstream. I mean, most Georgia voters want some sort of new restrictions on guns. It is just our primary system that discourages that in a broad sense, with Republicans going further to the right on issues as we saw in 2018 and in 2022 and a number of local legislative races. And so that has started to change, but also Democrats now have a proof point, right? For the last 20 years or so, Democrats kept on saying, we'll take back the state, we'll take back the state. And, election after election, Republicans won by 8 points, by 7 points, by 10 points. In 2016, that started to change with Donald Trump winning by just 5 points, which was a stunner, and, of course, losing the Atlanta suburbs. And in 2018, the 1.5 point victory from Brian Kemp gave Democrats more reason to believe they could do it. And then, of course, 2020 happened. And using Stacey Abrams' blueprint, using the pathway that she helped chart out to show how the state could flip by energizing voters who, again, skip these elections, because at this point still hundreds of thousands, more than 1 million voters who are eligible to vote will not vote in the election. I can guarantee you that. And so she and her campaign in 2018 tried to give them a reason to vote. In 2020, John Ossoff, Raphael Warnock, President Biden tried to give those Democrats a reason to vote. And in 2022, it's Republicans, even though they still control the statewide office, they know they're playing catch up here, right? They're trying to energize diverse populations. The Republican National Committee has opened up offices geared at Indian Americans, Black Americans, Asian Americans, mostly in the Atlanta suburbs, and they're trying to meet the Democratic ground game. Democrats have had this huge advantage on grassroots organizing, and now Republicans are trying to catch up. And that's what makes this election cycle so unpredictable, because even the polls, including the AJC poll, shows a really tight race for Senate and not as tight race for governor, with Kemp leading Abrams. We don't know how the electorate's going to look with all these energized and engaged voters that might not be showing up in the polls, right? The electorate might be vastly different than we're expecting because of the Dobbs decision, because a number of Democratic voters, or left-leaning voters, of women, and of independents who are just fed up with that Supreme Court ruling and maybe some other policies. We don't know how they show up in November and change the size and the scope of the electorate here.
Ernie, you want to answer?
That was so good. But no, I think that, Stacey and Raphael and John Ossoff showed us in 2020 that there's movement here in the state of Georgia for change and for diversity amongst our statewide elected officials, and I think that's very important. Whether or not Stacey's going to win in November is still an open question, but I do think, I kind of unfortunately monitor social media, and we talk about scared white man. What's the phrase you said?
Old white man is?
Yeah, old white man. I don't want to say it, but
Old white man is.
Okay. But when you talk about that phrase, and you look on social media and you see the attacks that are lobbied against Stacey Abrams about how she looks and about what she's going to represent. There's something very troubling in that, and I'm not, it's not who I'm going to vote for or not, but I just do think that there is still a very troubling aspect of our political dynamics here in the state of Georgia, in the South, and Stacey Abrams kind of represents that fear of a smart, I'll say this, a fear of a smart black person. And when you have smart black people out there, that causes fear, because I think that's kind of, when you talk about white manism or whatever, Public Enemy, one of my favorite rap groups, in 1991 had an album called Fear of a Black Planet. And that basically was fear of white manism, seeing that black people and gay people and people of color and Hispanics are going to eventually become equal parts of this government that, they set forth in 1776. So Stacey kind of represents that. So Raphael Warnock kind of represents that. I'm kind of, Greg, I'm doing a profile on Herschel Walker. So I've been kind of following Herschel Walker around the state for a little bit. And it's just a whole different dynamic as to how he's perceived versus how Stacey Abrams is perceived, versus how Raphael Warnock is perceived, versus even John Ossoff. And and I kind of look at and I kind of question, as a black man, why? What is it about Herschel Walker that is appealing to a certain percentage of our electorate that Raphael Warnock doesn't have that appeal, or Stacey doesn't have that appeal? And when you think about that, and when you look at it deeply, it's a representation of, God, I don't want to get in trouble. I see, when I look at the political field, I see a representation of what people want in a candidate, and to how that candidate can help accomplish what their goals are, regardless of what that candidate is going to present, or regardless of what that candidate can deliver on his own. It's a matter of what that candidate how I can use a candidate for my advantage. And I think that that's unfortunate as we go forward. So I do think that the state is changing. 2020 we're at a precipice, I think. Greg knows these numbers more than I do, but I think, just kind of an outside observer, I think 2020 is going to be a very telling time in our gubernatorial and senatorial races, to see where we go forward, how we continue to go forward as a state. And if we're going to go backwards, and I don't think any state, the way things are going now, any state can afford to go backwards. To not get in trouble.
If you want to learn how the white suburbs became Republican, I have a book I can recommend here. Shameless plug. I just got it yesterday, so I'm very excited.
Today is the debut.
Today is the book release date. So, shameless plug. I also have the first Republican Women's Club in Georgia was the Black Republican Women's Club in Sweet Auburn District. So there's a history of women in the Black women in the Republican Party. And speaking of women, my book is largely about women in the background who are making the politics possible for men. They're doing all of the work, and then Newt Gingrich and Jerry Falwell come along and think they created it, right? And I noticed that there's also women in these books doing background work. You've got Andrew Young has amazing women in his life who are, I don't really want to say supporting him because I think in many ways they're also guiding him. There's a lot of women running for office and also working behind the scenes. And of course, you talked about the women in your book. And first of all, I need to know if you actually know any woman with the beehive hairdo that shows up so often.
Do I actually, is there...
Do you know any women who do that beehive hairdo?
You know, I don't know why I did that. It's just, I've always, you know...
Maybe it's the messy bun, because I definitely rock that look a lot. But I was wondering if you could talk about the evolving work of women in Georgia politics. And I am all for your daughter being elected president. What is it going to take to elect one of us to be senator or governor up in this state?
Well, we'll find out in November about the latest fate, but Democrats have more women running for office. I think in 2014 they had a number of women running for office as well, but a surge in Democratic candidates in statewide office here who are women, and also, of course, for legislative offices and down-ticket offices. And so you're starting to see more women get engaged. One of my favorite parts of writing my book was talking to all the activists and organizers behind the scenes who got really energized by Donald Trump's victory in 2016 and decided to do something about it. And right down the street at Auburn Avenue at the Sister Louise's Ping Pong Emporium was one of the first big events where there was this group of young Democrats who had always met and always had the same 20 or 30 faces. And they had an event there at Sister Louise's called WTF Happened. And I won't say what the acronym means, but you know. And they got the biggest crowd they've ever seen. And I was there that night, and it was hundreds of people. There was a line out the door. And they realized we were onto something, and that if we can continue to channel that energy into action, right? Because a lot of people get energized and they get upset about things and they tweet things and then they kind of go away, right? But if you can kind of sustain that energy, you can affect some lasting change. And we saw the first glimpse of that just a few months after President Trump's victory. Stacey Abrams had her big first event I saw it as the kickoff to her gubernatorial campaign, because in 2017 I knew she was running for governor. I think everyone kind of who knew her kind of knew that she was. But there's also the rise of Jon Ossoff, who called me. I was visiting a friend in a hospital, and I'd never heard of the guy before, and he called me and he says, "Hey, I'm running for you for Congress in the special election, and I've got $250,000 in cash commitments, and I've got Hank Johnson and John Lewis's endorsement." And I said, "Oh crap, this guy's for real." Well, he helped channel that energy and help sustain that energy. He didn't win in 2017, but he helped lay the groundwork for Luce and McBath flipping that district just a few years later. So it is about the folks behind the scenes, women, men, the folks who are active and organized, who sustain that commitment. Because there's Democratic activists who sustain that commitment. There's plenty of Republican activists who sustain that commitment. But it takes time and effort. I go to these Saturday morning breakfasts all over Georgia for different parties, and it's amazing seeing how many devoted folks are showing up because they're fighting to see their community change.
Either of the other of you want to talk about women and what it's going to take?
Go ahead, Ernie.
Any goal?
Well, I think we're going to see in a couple months, just how Stacey Abrams is going to do. I think, she's obviously a very strong candidate with strong national ties. She's been on Star Trek, which But I mean,
Intergalactic ties.
intergalactic ties, exactly. So I think if Georgia is going to get a woman governor or senator, this is our best chance. This is the state's best chance. But you know, across the country, I'm not sure Greg probably knows this, how many women governors we have or have had in their past. And so it's not a great track record, but you know, I think Stacey gives the state a great chance.
Yeah, and she'd be the first elected black women governor in Georgia, and well, in the nation's history, but certainly Georgia's history as well.
Yeah.
I'm in church, so I'm not going to quote Lizzo exactly, but it's about dang time. So I always tell my students it's my dream to vote for one of them for office. So your book, Ernie, ends by asking Andrew Young for his bucket list. So I wanted to end today by asking each of you, what is on your bucket list? And it could be your professional bucket list, another project you want to do, or if you want to tell us a personal bucket list, I'm not going to stop you.
Well, yeah, I'll start. Well, I want to write another book. I want to, you know, I got the book bug now. So the book now that I'm kind of researching and working on is the last week of Prince's life. You know, as you know, his last concert was in Atlanta exactly a week before he died. Mike gave me his amazing cartoon that hangs on my wall. So that's the kind of book that I'm working on now. So if there's a bucket list, that would be it. The last week of Prince, the last Prince concert.
And my bucket list would be to do the illustrations for the Prince book.
All right.
Yes, I'm loving that.
And Ernie is right about the catching the book bug because it is addictive, right?
Yeah.
I actually asked Stacey Abrams after my book came out, I said, how do you stop writing books? Because it's so much fun. And of course, she isn't stopping writing books. She's still writing books while she's on the campaign trail, which I don't know how she does it. But no, I'd like to write another one, but I don't know the ending yet, so maybe you guys can help me out with that one.
It's funny because once I got this one done, I'm like, whoa, I don't know if I have another one in me. But I also have more footnotes than any of you have. So finally, I noticed you have a T-shirt challenge happening on Twitter. So I wanted to make sure Agnes Scott gets represented here. And I don't want to leave you guys out.
Thank you.
You get the football shirt.
Thank you very much.
So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. We're looking forward to seeing you just out at the book signing tent.
Oh, can I say one thing?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if you want to see Andy Young, Wednesday, he and I are on this amazing book tour. He's has more energy than I do. But on Wednesday at 6 o'clock at the Millennium Gate Museum, which is on 17th Street, it's a beautiful museum. We actually have an art exhibit of the book in the museum. So he and I are going to be there having a conversation at 6 o'clock. So please, if you can join us, please join us. He'll sign your books if you want, and it'll be fun.
One final thing, we should thank Robin for
thank you.
Leading this group. Thank you.
And we'll see y'all at the tent.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you. Thank you.